if people can't wrap their heads around consuming glucose, well, think about consuming how much glycogen you would get when you would consume a freshly killed animal.
On this week's podcast, I had the distinct pleasure of chatting with my buddy, James DiNicolantonio, who is a wealth of knowledge. He's written so many books. I believe his last one is called The Collagen Cure. We talk about all kinds of things. I ask him what he feels about carbs and keto and magnesium and hydration and salt and electrolytes. And we talk about all kinds of stuff. So James is a wealth of information. You will enjoy this podcast with him. I know you'll get a lot out of it. And look for our collabs on social media to promote this one. So enjoy this podcast with my friend, James DiNicolantonio. He's a pharmacist. And you guys are probably familiar with him on Instagram. He's a tweet master. James, thanks for coming on the podcast, man. It's been way too long.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So I was just going through some of your prolific tweets. You're like the tweet master. And I pulled out some highlights that I thought might be fun to start the podcast with. So one of the cooler ones I saw, which was very popular, was this notion that having visible abs, having a six-pack, is harder than becoming a millionaire. Mm-hmm. Where did you find the statistics around this? This is crazy.
Yeah, well, so essentially, in order for you to be able to have visible abs, you have to have at a minimum 14% body fat or less. So when you have 70% of US adults being overweight or obese, it's pretty rare to find someone with a six-pack nowadays.
Anything less than, somebody less than 14% body fat. So the numbers in that post were that 3 million people in the United States, which is 330 million humans. So 3 million people have visible abs. And there's 22 million people with a net worth of more than $1 million. So we're talking like 6-7x here. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Like essentially 1% of the US population has the body fat necessary to even have visible abs.
Oh my gosh. So what's your body fat, man? I'm pretty sure you have visible abs, but I never see photos of you.
Yeah, no, I do. It's not like super like, wow, this is the best six-pack ever, but I do have a six-pack. I would probably say I'm at around 14%, like right around that cusp, 13, 14%. So
that's cool. So I haven't taken my shirt off as much on Instagram recently, but I've still got abs. I'll take my shirt off soon. I think maybe I'll do a post with a hat tip to you citing those statistics and talking about it. But I've still got abs, people. It's all still there. I just wanted to get away from the shirtless Paul version of me to more of the, here's some good value about your nutrition stuff. So one of your other tweets that I thought was amazing was talking about this bagel study versus eggs. You'll have to send me this reference because I haven't seen it. There's been some like hate on eggs, basically since 2017 and the whole TMAO thing and choline, which we can talk about. But you mentioned this study that I guess it compared two groups of obese women, and one group was given eggs for breakfast and the other group was given bagels. This is wild.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an 8-week study in overweight women. And essentially there's been actually a couple studies. There's been about 3 studies comparing either eggs to cereal or eggs to bagels. And every single study shows is that you end up eating less total calories for the day when you start your morning with, let's say, a higher protein breakfast, such as eggs versus bagels or cereal. And then there's also a greater weight loss as well.
What the heck? But aren't eggs gonna cause me to die because of TMAO, James?
Oh, the whole TMAO thing. So, TMAO is actually, if it's only moderately elevated, it's just simply a marker typically of insulin resistance in the liver. So what happens is when your liver becomes insulin resistant, something called FMO3 increases, which then increases TMAO. So if you had, and so it's really not necessarily, let's say, choline or eggs or carnitine from red meat that's a problem. It's actually the liver insulin resistance that's creating the high TMAO, which is the problem.
And I've seen multiple studies and assays of this suggesting that an equivalent amount of fish contains more preformed TMAO than the same amount of red meat that has choline and carnitine that would make TMAO in your gut if you had the proper, well, not proper, but if you had gut bacteria that would transform choline or carnitine into TMAO in the human body, which is wild.
100%. And we know that eating fish is not associated with any type of risk. It's associated with lower risks of dementia, heart disease, as we know. So TMAO, I think, it's just a marker of disease. If you have very elevated levels too, that's typically a sign of kidney disease.
Exactly.
Right. So it's like either liver insulin resistance or kidney disease is why all of these studies are associating elevated levels of TMAO with heart disease.
And there was an interesting paper that came out a few years ago, and it really showed pretty strong reverse causality, like between TMAO and things like heart disease or diabetes or kidney disease specifically. And this is just this complex, well, overly esoteric statistical term that when you have kidney disease, if your kidneys don't work well, then you're going to accumulate more TMAO. So higher levels of TMAO may associate with kidney disease, but that doesn't mean that TMAO causes kidney disease.
Right.
If you have insulin resistance, you're going to have higher levels of TMAO. It doesn't mean insulin resistance. It doesn't mean that insulin resistance is caused by TMAO. It's probably the reverse, that insulin resistance causes TMAO to go up and kidney disease causes TMAO to go up. So I think that that's interesting because I'll have to grab those studies from you. I would love to do some content on that because it's just solid proof that, hey, look, whole animal foods are a very good way to eat your breakfast. And I mean, some of the headlines people were posting were like, eggs are worse than cigarettes. And eggs, the most crazy one was from kind of a shit posting website. And that's the headline was, eggs are causing sudden death. It's like, well, maybe something else is causing sudden death these days that we can't talk about, but it's probably not eggs. Rob Wolf did a post about it. He was like, definitely not anything else that happened in the last few years. Right. Did you see this?
Yeah, I saw, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was bonkers. It was just crazy. So, all right, people, you can eat your eggs. So, James, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
Let's see. I had 3 eggs with probably 5 ounces of grass-fed steak, and then probably like 2-3 ounces of potatoes.
Nice. What kind of potatoes?
Just organic yellow potatoes, and then I also had one pear too.
All right.
Yeah.
I want to talk about carbohydrates. Maybe that's a good entrance for that.
Yeah.
How many carbohydrates do you think you're getting in a day right now?
Probably like 150 on really hard exercise days, maybe 200. And a lot of it is loaded around the time of exercise. So I would say probably 30 to 40% of all my carbohydrate intake is probably post-exercise, to be fair.
And what kind of a window are you looking at that in? Like an hour after exercise?
Yeah, within an hour, probably. There's a ton of reasons why you want to sort of try to get a lot of your nutrients post-exercise. A lot of times the creatine pumps are upregulated. Basically, you can drive collagen into the cell better, and the amino acids too into the cell better, especially if you have some carbs and protein. So if you're taking creatine, there's been 2 studies that have compared post-exercise versus pre-exercise supplementation, and post beats pre because of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So post-exercise supplementation of creatine is better because of these pumps, or like your body is more willing to take things up.
Yeah, just really almost any nutrient. Your exercised muscle is more sensitive to soaking up nutrients.
And what does the literature say about the window? I've always heard canonically or colloquially like an hour or so.
Yeah, that literally is about an hour, where the skeletal muscle is much more sensitive to insulin. And so, there's a lot of people saying, well, it doesn't matter if you ingest your protein after or before. And that's kind of true when it comes to protein, as long as it's close to the time of exercise. And the second key is as long as your total amount of protein hits, maximal protein synthesis, which is typically around 2.2 grams per kilogram.
Or like 1 gram per pound, essentially.
Essentially, we don't like to use essentially like body weight when we're talking to the general public, because most people are overweight. So you try to say lean body weight, right? Or ideal body weight to maybe make it a little more clear. But yeah, essentially around 1 to 1.25 grams of protein per pound of ideal body weight is where you're going to get not only maximal muscle protein synthesis, but better satiety, weight loss, etc.
Yeah, that's what I think about when I'm thinking about the macros. If you have protein, fat, and carbohydrates, and I'm responding to a comment on Instagram or a DM and somebody's saying like, what should I eat? I think that most people, and you can let me know if you agree with this, most people would do well to start by thinking about how much protein they're getting in a day. Yeah. And this is just like high level we're not talking about micronutrients yet, but we can. We're just talking macronutrients, protein, fat, carbohydrates. I think most people, if there were more focus on people getting, quote, adequate amounts of protein, I think a lot of people would feel better. And I think this is the way to start. I would agree with you 100%, like 1 gram per pound of goal body weight. But I wonder how many people, if you had to guess, how many people in the United States do you think actually get the proper, quote, amount of protein per day?
You'll find statistics that the average American is basically just barely hitting the RDA, like 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram. So they're barely hitting the recommended dietary allowance for protein, which is basically the bare minimum to survive, but certainly not to thrive.
Yeah, so 0.8 grams per kilogram would be like 0.4-ish per pound. And
yes.
we're talking, 2x that, 2.2x that. So people are getting, just back of the envelope, we could say maybe people are getting 35 to 40% of their optimal protein amounts in a day. And then the question becomes, how much of the protein is coming from highly bioavailable sources, right? Because this is something I've talked a lot about, and I've seen you talk about it too. Like, all protein isn't really created equally.
Right.
And from your perspective, meat versus plant protein, like bioavailability, what do we got here?
Yeah. Not just from a bioavailable perspective, but I think even more importantly, the bioavailable nutrient perspective, which you've covered ad nauseum as well. Really, when you think about it too, from like an evolutionary and our own physiology, like Mickey Bendor really just opened the door on this for everyone. Like, we were hyper carnivores. Certainly, for the last 2.6 million years, I would say at least 70% of the calories were likely, for most of our ancestors, were coming from animals, very large mammoths and elephants, etc. And Mickey Bendor has published amazing papers on this topic. And so our physiology is really adapted to a very high animal fat/protein intake.
Yeah. And for those who are interested, I've had Mickey on the podcast twice in the past. You can just search whatever platform you like to look for your podcasts on, and you'll find it's Miki, and then his last name is Ben, Ben-Dor. And I think he's Israeli, right? I think he's Israeli. Yeah. So I've had some really interesting anthropology conversations with Mickey and learned a lot from him. Since we've gone past the creatine thing a few times, let's just talk about this in detail. I've seen you post about this and really appreciate it. Like, can you think of a single more researched or more effective supplement or nutrient, quote unquote, than creatine for humans? I can't really.
No, probably not, because it's been studied for decades, like 50 years. And it's consistently shown significant increases in muscle strength, muscle mass, particularly supplementing around the time of exercise and around 3 to 5 grams per day. What's so cool, what's so interesting is that there's a 7-fold difference in regards to how much creatine phosphate gets stored if you take creatine around the time of exercise versus not. It's a 7-fold difference. So
wow.
If you want to get a 7-fold increase on the benefits of creatine, don't take it while fasting or before bedtime. You take it around the time of exercise, particularly post-exercise. And that's not even counting the 50 to 60% increase that you'll see when you also take it with carbohydrates as well.
Okay. So the protocol for creatine could be 3 to 5 grams per day plus carbohydrates in that 1 hour window after exercise.
Yeah, ideally too, with about 30, 40 grams of protein as well will help with the insulin release and help with the creatine being stored.
And we can just begin the conversation about hydration. How much fluid would you take that with? Or isn't this hydration kind of an important thing to consider here too?
Yeah, it is. So anecdotally, and also clinically, creatine monohydrate definitely increases the water content of the muscles, like the intracellular water content. So you have to increase your intake of water and electrolytes when you start taking creatine. Otherwise, you're going to sort of dehydrate other parts of the body.
Okay. And so this is something that I've thought about a lot. Like, to get 5 grams of creatine per day from food, it's not that easy. I mean, perhaps if you're in a tribe and you have a huge kill and you're eating, I mean, when I calculated it, it was like over 2 pounds of meat per day. So like 2.1 or 2.2 pounds of meat to get 5 grams of creatine per day.
Yeah.
So I think most people are not eating that much meat. Some people listening to this who are large humans or who are kind of interested in this hyper carnivorism, or I definitely have met both men and women who consume 2 pounds of meat per day. But I think a lot of people are not getting this much creatine per day. My perspective, or what I'm aware of, is that if you do a loading dose of creatine of 20 grams a day, you can saturate the muscles in 5 days.
Yeah. And
correct me if I'm wrong here. And then if you do 5 grams a day, it takes around 20 to 30 days to saturate the muscles. Is that right?
It takes about 4 weeks. Yeah.
4 weeks. Is there, like, at what point does it sort of not reach saturation? Do you have any data on this or any sense? Like if somebody's getting 3 grams of creatine per day, which is probably more reachable for most of us from food, can we extrapolate and say maybe 60 days, like 2 months to saturate the muscles? Or, I wonder like what the flux is of creatine in versus out.
Yeah, we don't know what the threshold is for creatine phosphate storage and what total creatine we can get the muscles and brain to. But based on some good data combining the precursor to the formation of creatine with creatine, which dramatically increases the storage of creatine phosphate compared to just creatine alone, like around 8-fold difference. It seems like there's a lot of room to play with in regards to how much more you can increase your creatine phosphate stores
through supplementation, through post-exercise window, through carbohydrates, with protein, through all the things to optimize it.
Correct. Yeah.
Interesting. So I'm thinking for myself, maybe this means that my exercise is usually a morning surf. And when I come back from my morning surf, I usually have a glass of raw milk with some honey. So I'm getting carbohydrates, I'm getting protein. If I wanted to get more protein, I could put a little creatine in there and get the protein, the carbohydrates, the creatine, and do it all together. I mean,
yeah,
I'm thinking out loud. Hopefully that helps people translate what it looks like for them. I mean,
right.
Chocolate milk has been studied as this great ergogenic aid post exercise. I wouldn't necessarily do chocolate milk with sucrose. I'd rather do raw goat's milk with honey, but it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, totally. I know, like everything gets a bad rap, and there's not necessarily bad foods, although I would disagree there are, but people will say there are only bad diets, right? But yes, if you time more refined carbohydrates specifically in a post-exercise window, you can kind of get away with it much better than not.
Interesting. I saw you post about drinking orange juice online.
Yeah.
And you said that you were drinking a few ounces of orange juice throughout the day. Are you using orange juice post-exercise or are you using it all throughout the day right now?
So it really depends on my activity level, but yes, always after post-exercise, like my body just craves some type of, glucose surge, and orange juice seems to be something that my body just craves. So that's why I started doing it. I started running a lot more, like 5 days a week. I'd run 1 to 2 miles a day. When you deplete your glycogen stores, I think you really start benefiting when you start doing that timed carbohydrate intake to replenish them. My cognition is so much better when I have a few ounces of orange juice, 2-3 times a day versus not. My mood is better. So there's definitely something at play here. And it comes down to the whole low carb. If you're inducing a low carb state because your activity level is going up, then you have to sort of match your intake now. Otherwise, you're going to start seeing your health decline.
Yeah, that is something that I learned firsthand. And it's been difficult to find the best way to communicate. I think because so many people started following me when I was strictly ketogenic and carnivore. And now when I talk about carbohydrates, I get a lot of pushback, especially on YouTube. There's just this strongly dogmatic, and I appreciate passion. But there's a strongly dogmatic community on YouTube that just can't seem to wrap their heads around the notion that carbohydrates could be beneficial for humans. It took my life to a whole new level. Check out this review on Whole Package from Heart and Soil Supplements. The addition of Whole Package from Heart and Soil Supplements has truly transformed my life. From the supplements to the animal-based diet and lifestyle, this company and way of living has created an upward spiral and domino effect of positive changes in my life. At 22 years old, I feel as if I'm now on the right path, and it started with the right dietary choice, workout regimen, and the supplements, especially whole package, really took my life to a whole new level. Paul and the supplements changed my life forever. This supplement was mentioned on Joe Rogan with Forrest Gallant about the fact that whole package contains androgens. All of our supplements at Heart and Soil received Informed Sports certification for purity, but whole package didn't, because whole package contains androgens, multiple derivatives of testosterone, including testosterone, which are found in testicles, and they won't certify a supplement that contains testosterone. Now, all the androgens in whole package are naturally occurring, but they won't certify it. So, as I've said before, if you're a professional athlete, somebody that might be drug tested, be careful with this one. For the rest of us, it's a great way to get bioactive testosterone and metabolites into your diet, and that can change your life. Look at the reviews for whole package on our website, and you will see what I mean. And if you have any questions about the bioavailability of this, look at the reviews on our website, and you'll see what I mean. And there's good evidence that the peptides, the cofactors, the hormones found in desiccated organs are bioavailable, especially when consumed with long-chain saturated fatty acids like the kind found in the steak you're eating with your whole package. So, So our mission at Heart and Soil is to help you reclaim your birthright to optimal radical health. Find whole package and all of our supplements at heartandsoil.co. So I don't know if you know this or not, but on some of the carnivore or keto forums, people thought that your account was hacked when you said that you were drinking orange juice.
I did see some comments like that. It's just like April Fool's joke or something people were saying.
Yeah. Why do you think? So how do we help educate people here? Like, why do you think people have so much trouble wrapping their heads around the benefits of something like orange juice?
Yeah. I think because
how do we enlighten them?
There's two camps, I feel like. So
yeah,
when you have a sort of like a more sedentary, low carb fasting camp, right? That works better. And then when you become more athletic, when you start running more, when you start working out more, you start getting that six pack, you start appreciating the benefits of carbs. So there's two camps, and I've sort of switched more to an active, much more active person. And now I'm definitely more pro carb because carbs are going to benefit me versus they probably weren't as beneficial when I was not as active. I was doing more of more longer intermittent fasts, things like that. So it's almost like be sedentary and eat less carbs, or be active and eat more carbs. And I prefer the latter. I prefer being more active and integrating more carbohydrates.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. I like that. And I am someone that also prefers to be active. There's just too many cool things to do in the world. I want to go exploring. I want to go hike and jump off a waterfall and go swim in a river. And I want to go surfing. And so it benefited me. And for anyone that doesn't know my story, I was strictly carnivore with meat and organs and fat, no fruit, no carbohydrates from the foods I was eating other than the stored glycogen in the muscle meat, which was negligible for a year and a half. And then I ended up having, my thyroid labs were declining. My subjective body temperature was lower. My pulse became lower, which isn't always a good thing. I had sleep disturbances, electrolyte issues, hormones declining, and all kinds of problems that really improved rapidly when I added carbohydrates back. Now, I've always been an active person, so perhaps there was a mismatch there. Do you think that if someone is more sedentary and they want to do more fasting, and we can talk about fasting too in a moment, do you think there's a minimum amount of carbohydrates they should eat? Or do you think that a zero carb, fully ketogenic diet can work for some people?
Yeah, so I think you see more benefits from fasting from people that are sedentary and overweight. Whereas if we're talking about fasting 24 hours or longer, there's very few benefits for someone who is lean and active. That's actually very counterproductive when you start fasting longer than 24 hours in an active, lean individual.
Yeah. And then, so what about somebody who is sedentary and wants to lose weight? Does that person need carbohydrates at all? Do you think?
That's a good question. So I think you don't want to just completely shut off the carbohydrate intake because you want the body to sort of start to become more accustomed, right, to burning fat for fuel, right? And we know that can take anywhere from like 1 to 2 months to really optimize that type of metabolism. So slowly decreasing the carbohydrate intake will not only help, through the whole metabolic system and burning the fuel that the body is not accustomed to burning, but also the fact that you're going to have significantly less losses of electrolytes, particularly salt, if you slowly taper the carbs down versus just stopping carb intake and dropping insulin, and now you're just flushing out salt like crazy.
Yeah, that was something that I definitely had when I was zero carb carnivore. And I was eating organs and I was doing a lot of electrolyte supplements, but I ran into electrolyte issues that were intractable. No matter how much salt, how much magnesium, how much potassium I took in, I would have muscle cramps and palpitations and wake up in the middle of the night with arrhythmias. So I think this is an underappreciated, under-discussed thing in ketogenic communities, how severe these electrolyte derangements can be without some sort of insulin signaling connected with carbohydrates. Now, I know that protein is going to give us some insulin signaling, but there's just at the level of the kidneys, I think that insulin has value in a postprandial state, not all the time. We don't want to be insulin resistant and have chronically elevated insulin, but I don't really understand why insulin has gotten such a bad rap when it literally keeps us alive, and the postprandial after eating insulin spike is valuable for us at the level of maintenance of electrolytes in the kidney, something that I did not learn about in medical school, but is clearly documented, at the level of glutathione, at the level of hormones, at the level of so many pieces in the human body. Have you run into this in your sort of educational efforts, that people kind of demonize insulin and they just want to keep it as low as possible all the time?
Yeah, 100%, because I think really starting from good calories, bad calories, it was almost like, right, just keep insulin as low as possible, and the carb insulin hypothesis. And there is some truth to that. But again, it's always so nuanced in the fact that, insulin is a signaling molecule, and it's required for, the utilization of, glucose and fats and, et cetera. So it is something that we need. We just don't want to be resistant to it, and we just don't want it to be chronically elevated.
Right. So I want to circle back to that point, but while we're here, I'll ask you, so how do you think humans become resistant to insulin? This is a really important question that I wish Western medicine addressed more directly.
Yeah. So just like with anything in life, there's many ways to skin a cat when it comes to what can cause insulin resistance. I think the two most evidence-based substances that we know for sure causes insulin resistance from human clinical trials would be refined carbohydrates and refined sugars, 100%. Now, above and beyond that, I think that over-consuming omega-6 seed oils, particularly if they are not like cold pressed, particularly if they are high heat, and particularly at a high dose, which most people are consuming. The average American gets about 20% of their calories from soybean oil alone, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But any nutrient deficiency, particularly a deficiency in magnesium, a deficiency in thiamine, this has been proven in clinical studies in humans, like deficiency studies run in like the 1940s and 50s, that you can induce diabetes and prediabetes simply by cutting out magnesium or cutting out thiamine. Vitamin C also, that if you're too low on vitamin C, that can induce insulin resistance. So that's part of the equation. But there's cortisol too that can induce insulin resistance. In fact, John Yudkin showed in rats that cortisone, because rats don't produce cortisol, that's the human equivalent, is cortisone, actually increases before insulin. So actually Yudkin hypothesized that it's actually cortisol that's elevating first, intracellular cortisol, as well as just, in the serum before insulin, which is kind of crazy. So there's a lot of hormone things too that can induce insulin resistance, even being deficient in inositol, which basically when insulin hits its receptor, molecules of inositol get released, which is actually what causes GLUT4 to come up to the cell's membrane and allows glucose to be utilized and burned, is actually inositol compounds. So being deficient in that, which we form from glucose, inositol, but it requires magnesium and it requires good levels of NAD, which can be depleted by inflammation. So inflammation can cause insulin resistance, which we know too. We know that. Sorry, it's a long laundry list of things that can induce insulin resistance.
No, it's great. It's all connected. So on the previous couple of podcasts that I did with Georgi Dinkov, we talked a lot about cortisol and its connection with diabetes, and how cortisol blockers are very effective for diabetics, which is not something that's ever talked about. There's a a pharmaceutical mifepristone, which is also known as RU486, which has cortisol blocking properties. It's used as an abortion pill in the States, but it also has cortisol blocking properties. And it seems to have some efficacy, significant efficacy in treating diabetes, if I'm not mistaken. So the cortisol piece, I think from Georgie's perspective, is connected with things like stress or poor sleep, but also from gut inflammation. So it's not as complex as it needs to be for people. And one hypothesis that I can at least draw out in my mind is, if you inflame your gut from a variety of things, we can talk about what things might inflame the gut, then, that could cause systemic inflammation, and that could lead to cortisol increasing. We definitely know that lipopolysaccharide, also known as endotoxin from gram-negative cell walls, moving across the GI epithelium causes cortisol to rise. So, things in the gut can trigger cortisol increase, and that can lead to hormonal derangements, which can lead to insulin resistance. I totally agree with you about high linoleic acid seed oils being problematic for a variety of reasons. I think they directly have a number of toxic effects that I've spoken about on numerous other podcasts. We don't have to go too far down the seed oil rabbit hole. But what's been interesting for me recently is looking at differences between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose. Have you seen some of this research? It's quite compelling.
So from a biochemical perspective, sucrose is 50% glucose, 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup can be as high as 58%, but typically is 55% in the US. And some people will say that 5% extra fructose doesn't seem to be that much big of a difference. It's also, if you're talking about like naturally occurring sucrose, which is another name for sugar, versus high fructose corn syrup is synthetically made, there may be some differences too in regards to the effects of high fructose corn syrup versus, let's say, just natural sugar coming from sugar cane.
Yeah, I mean, so sucrose is a disaccharide of sucrose and glucose and fructose. And my understanding is that high fructose corn syrup is a lot of free glucose and free free glucose and free fructose because of the way it's made. It starts with corn syrup. So it starts with a glucose polymer, whether amylose or amylopectin. And then they have to isomerize some of the glucose to make it into fructose. The way they used to make high fructose corn syrup, and I haven't seen evidence to fully prove this isn't still a problem, there were a lot of chloralkali reagents used, which can have mercury contamination to the effect of, I think, I'm just pulling these numbers and I don't remember the exact study. It was like 0.5 micrograms per gram of mercury. It was a significant amount of mercury that used to contaminate high fructose corn syrup up until 2009. And the corn manufacturers claim that doesn't happen anymore. But I mean, high fructose corn syrup could be contaminated with mercury. And then I came across GC mass spec study looking at high fructose corn syrup in sugar sweetened beverages, things like Gatorade has it in the States, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, most sodas have high fructose corn syrup in the US. In Latin America, a lot of times they use sucrose or claim they use sucrose as opposed to high fructose corn syrup. But when they did the gas chromatography mass spec, they had 4 to 5 times more calories than were listed on the label. And I thought, how come these people haven't talked about? I'll have to send you the study. Yeah.
Wow.
It was like, what is going on here? And whether it's undigested starches or it's like, wow, okay, that's a real problem. If you're suddenly, a can of Coke has 500 calories, like, wow. And it says, 140 on the label or something. That's crazy. And we need more research there, but it was, they're just putting these multiple beverages into a lab analytic machine and seeing like there's more calories in there than are listed on the label. So it's hidden calories. And it makes sense. You have this, high fructose corn syrup is a quote synthetic sugar. Again, we're splitting hairs here and getting a little bit specific in our verbiage, but sucrose comes from a sugar cane. I have sugar cane on my counter, and they made this high fructose corn syrup out of corn, which didn't have any fructose to begin with.
Right. Yeah. I think, too, the piece that a lot of people forget is, Kimber Stanhope, her group, has done a really good job at actually showing that even matched for calories, that fructose is more harmful than glucose. So even having more fructose in high fructose corn syrup versus sucrose can actually potentially play an additional harmful role of high fructose corn syrup too.
Do you fear fructose in your diet? I know you're drinking orange juice.
Yeah, not from natural sources, not if it's timed correctly, and not if someone's metabolically healthy, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the key. Like, I'm not telling people to consume 10 ounces of orange juice 2 to 3 times a day. It's 2 ounces of orange juice 2 to 3 times a day, right? And that's a big difference. And also, I'm an active individual. So, yeah, it's context and nuance when it comes to all this stuff.
I'll go out on a limb and tell people to consume 10 ounces of orange juice twice a day. I think that's great. I freaking love orange juice. And orange juice is high in thiamine. So, one of the things that I've done on the podcast, people can go back and look at this, is put my diet through Chronometer online from a couple different permutations. And it was interesting to see, like, where am I getting magnesium? Because when people think about any diet, whether it's animal-based or paleo or keto, they always say, where are you getting your magnesium? And I mean, I was getting 450 milligrams of magnesium per day from the foods. I want to talk about magnesium specifically with you, and people can find that. I did a reel on Instagram where I talk about where I'm getting magnesium from, but I was also getting 140% of the RDA and thiamine every single day. A lot of that coming from orange juice. So you mentioned thiamine deficiency leading to insulin resistance. Well, I mean, fruit, multiple types of fruit, which contain fructose, which I think personally has been villainized. And there's a lot of nuance there that hasn't been appreciated. Refined fructose and high fructose corn syrup versus naturally occurring fructose, like you're saying, probably timed well and titrated based on activity levels. Yeah. There's interesting things there. So a lot of these fruits that have these things can come with some beneficial nutrients. I mean, even maple syrup has a pretty good amount of manganese. People often ask, like, where do you get your manganese? Well, I mean, maple syrup has manganese, guys. I don't know how much manganese deficiency there actually is, but there's a lot of nutrients that can come in fruit or fruit juices. But I did a reel on Instagram, what I eat in a day, and I like to mix them up a little bit so it's not exactly the same diet. And people were like, "You're just drinking sugar with that orange juice," and I'm thinking, okay, I don't know how to help people understand this is pretty beneficial for humans. I mean, I'm fresh squeezing it. I'm like juicing the thing with a freaking handle myself. I want to come to this point in a moment, but I'll ask you first. Do you get blood work regularly? Because that's been a fun thing for me to kind of share with my followers.
I get blood work once a year. Typically, I use Inside Tracker to get my blood work.
Are you willing to share your recent like hemoglobin A1C and like fasting insulin?
Yeah. So to be clear, my A1C was, before I started supplementing with thiamine, was about like 5.2. And then once I started supplementing with thiamine, it went to 4.8. So, just being deficient in some nutrients can help you even optimize. Like most people would say, 5.2, that's great, because 6.5 is diabetes. So 5.2, that's pretty good. But you can, that's what I'm trying to show, is that real time, you can improve an A1C from 5.2 to 4.8, in my case, just by supplementing with thiamine.
Yeah, my A1C is pretty consistently on this diet 5.4. So it's a little higher than yours. I do eat a lot of carbohydrates because I'm pretty active. But what's interesting, and I got permission from my friend's dad to share this. We won't share his actual blood work, but we can put his blood work on the screen. So my friend's dad is 0 carb, or probably 20 grams of carbs a day from blueberries, if that. He eats butter and he eats steak, and his A1C is 5.5. Right. So, I mean, this is a challenge that I will issue on this podcast to any of the and I respect all of these people on YouTube, any of the low carb advocates on YouTube, any of the strict carnivores, like, show me your labs. I texted one of my friends who's a doctor on YouTube, and I said, hey, let's do another podcast. And let's go over both of our labs, because my suspicion, I could be wrong about this, is that my A1C will be lower or equivalent to theirs. And I'm eating 250 grams of carbohydrates a day. Right. And my fasting insulin will be equivalent to theirs. So my fasting insulin is 3. No matter whether, it was probably 3.5 or 3 when I was 0 carb carnivore, and it's still 3. And people can look back to my podcast and see this, but I'm eating 250 plus grams of carbohydrates a day, and my fasting insulin is 3. My fasting blood glucose is 84, and my A1C is 5.4. And your A1C is 5.2 and now 4.8. What's your fasting insulin? I bet it's like 3.
I've never actually had a fasting insulin.
James. The most important blood work. I'm sure it's 5. I'm sure it's 3, but I'm curious. Yeah. That would be really interesting. But I do think that there's been a lot of loss of nuance around this carbohydrate conversation. And generally the message that I see mostly on YouTube, and I love all you YouTubers, I'm just saying you guys are sometimes kind of dogmatic, is that carbs are bad. You're carb addicted, James, because you're drinking 3 ounces of orange juice a day. And I'm definitely carb addicted because I had 12 ounces of orange juice at breakfast. So here's another thing I'll bring up. I saw this, and I'll get your perspective on this. I saw this on Instagram yesterday, and it kind of bummed me out a little bit. One of my friends, a health influencer, tweeted something saying a well-known, I think he said a famous Ray Peat influencer just found out that he's pre-diabetic, eating orange juice, maple syrup, honey, etc. And now he's going zero carb. People in the comments were saying, like, at Carnivore MD, is this you? It's not me, guys. I'm not pre-diabetic. You can look at the blood work that we just shared. But you do research, and this is a guy named Matt Blackburn, who's been an advocate for a Ray Peat perspective.
Right.
And what Matt Blackburn did is he wore a continuous glucose monitor. He didn't have an A1C. He doesn't have a fasting insulin. He wore a continuous glucose monitor. And the people at that continuous glucose monitor told him that he was pre-diabetic. And so first of all, I'm like, that's complete bullshit. You cannot make a diagnosis of diabetes based on a continuous glucose monitor. I think they're great. I'm a huge fan of NutriSense. And I think people wearing continuous glucose monitors really helps them understand. And you can see patterns on continuous glucose monitors that suggest insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance or metabolic dysregulation. But for this guy, for this influencer, to say I'm pre-diabetic based on a CGM is basically the company that did it, which was not NutriSense, it was another company, is way out of their league telling him it's pre-diabetic. Get an A1C, get a fasting insulin. And I don't understand why this guy would go then zero carb, because your CGM might look better, but I'm pretty sure your A1C is going to go up. I mean, have you encountered this like how do I phrase this? I feel like there is, and you can agree or disagree with me, I feel like there's an overly rigid, detrimental focus on absolute blood glucose numbers that is hurting people. People freak out if their blood glucose goes over 110 milligrams per deciliter. And in his post, this guy said, I was having postprandial increases in my blood glucose of 30 milligrams per deciliter. And I'm thinking, that sounds pretty healthy to me. There's nothing wrong with a 30 milligram per deciliter increase in your blood glucose. That's my perspective, but I would love for your perspective on this idea of like how strictly we really follow our blood glucose.
Yeah, because it totally depends on how long that elevation is staying for. Because the earliest and best way to diagnose diabetes is actually an insulin assay, a postprandial insulin assay. So, basically it's how long insulin is elevated for. And typically that may or may not reflect glucose. So, because you can have really good glucose numbers, but that could be being controlled by a ton of insulin, right? Like your glucose is low, but your insulin's super high. I don't believe though, that if you have small or even fairly decent spikes in blood glucose every now and then, if it comes down quickly and your muscles are soaking it up really quickly and you're not metabolically compromised, that's normal. That's going to happen. And I don't think there's a ton of damage that occurs from that. If it's not staying elevated for a particularly long period of time. And even if it is, we don't even know exactly, okay, if you hit 140, it's got to be 1 hour, for this to be actually harmful or not. We still have a ton of work to do in regards to how harmful glucose spikes are.
Yeah, I think this is widely misunderstood and widely talked about without a solid foundation of research to support it. People worry in the online community. And again, I love you guys. I just want to offer you a different perspective. If you're listening to this and you fall into this category, people worry in the online community that any spike, quote unquote, in blood sugar is bad for them. Well, I think that it's more important to consider the total AUC, the area under the curve. And if your A1C is 6.2, like some well-known carnivore influencers, or 5.7 or 5.8, and mine is 5.4, or James is 5.2 or 4.8, then you're not getting any insulin spikes, but your total area under the curve, you're not getting any glucose spikes, but your total insulin, and your total glucose area under the curve is potentially greater than someone who is eating carbohydrates. So from that respect, I mean, it's at least equivalent, but it's never discussed in that manner. There's just this fear that glucose in the blood equals bad, and that's going to glycate your tissues or affect the glycocalyx or cause this or that to misfunction. And yet, if you don't eat glucose, your liver makes it.
Right.
And yet it's toxic for us and it's glycating all of our tissues, and any spike in it is bad. And I think people have gotten so confused about this. I think that my suspicion is that the real pathology lies in hyperinsulinemia rather than in hyperglycemia.
Yeah,
because
I agree.
Yeah, would you agree with that?
Well, the thing too that people are forgetting is an animal, a freshly killed animal, is a tremendous source of glycogen. So a fresh liver is going to have 400 grams of glycogen. That'd be a fairly small animal about our size, not a gigantic mammoth, right? And then the skeletal muscle glycogen is going to be over twice that when you're consuming fresh meat. We don't consume fresh meat and fresh liver anymore, most of us. There's a huge difference in the amount of glycogen you get from the two. Correct me if I'm wrong. It takes a while post-mortem for the glycogen to be depleted. So if people can't wrap their heads around consuming glucose, well, think about consuming how much glycogen you would get when you would consume a freshly killed animal.
I love this point, and it kind of harkens back to the conversation with Mickey Bendor. Yes, our ancestors appeared to have a lot of their protein from animal sources based on carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur dating of the remains of the bones of them, the stable isotope studies. But there's no refrigeration 50, 100,000 years ago. They were probably not low carb. Right. And so this was something that I overlooked in my research on carnivore diets and research on meat-only diets without carbohydrates, is that you can find, or I could find anthropology to suggest this, and you can find hunter-gatherer tribes that eat a lot of meat. But even when I was with the Hadza, they loved honey and berries. But eating freshly killed animals is not low carb.
Right.
And so the animal meat wouldn't have stayed long enough to become very low carb. Perhaps some of it would have if you're drying it as jerky. Right. But I mean, at least a good portion of the animal meat and livers was eaten fresh by all the people in the tribe. And even if you're just eating an animal kill, there's glycogen in there. I mean, when I was with the Hadza in Tanzania, we hunted a baboon. And believe me, that baboon was eaten within hours. The whole thing was gone. Mm-hmm. Like the whole thing is gone. The liver was gone among everyone in the tribe within less than an hour. And then all the other organs are gone before we even get back to camp. And then the muscle meat is shared along the tribe, and we ate the brains the next day. That's a different story. I don't think I got prion disease. But yeah, I love this point that historically, even if you were just eating meat and organs, that would have had significant amounts of carbohydrates that break down within, I don't know, we could do the studies. Do you have any data on that? I don't know exactly how fast it breaks down.
I think it takes a full 24 hours to break down all of the glycogen. And the other thing to think about too is the more predominant animal consuming cultures lived in colder climates, and the freezing climates, let's say, of the Inuit would probably prevent that from occurring. So they could basically have meat. It wouldn't even have to be quote unquote after a fresh kill. It would just be frozen. And that process wouldn't happen until it would completely thaw out. But I think it does take, it takes hours. It's not going to happen within 1 hour. I'm pretty sure there's some that starts to occur within 4, but you're going to still have some until about, I think it takes full 24 hours for most of it to basically be depleted.
Super interesting. And you can imagine that I'd have to talk to my friend Will Harris at White Oak Pastures, who make, in my opinion, some of the best meat, well raised and well tended and humanely slaughtered meat out there. But once they kill a cow, I wonder how quickly it goes into a freezer and then it's packaged. And you could think about but I mean, it would just be pretty interesting and pretty easy to think, all right, if you're getting meat on the shelf in your butcher at any store, you're going to how much glycogen is actually left in that meat. That meat's been going through the supply chain for weeks. Well, I don't know, at least a week, I would say. A few days for sure.
Typically, they hang a steak for 2-3 weeks to tenderize it. You know what I mean? That glycogen is gone.
Yeah, even at lower temperatures, perhaps. I mean, yeah. I think there's a lot to be said there. We talked a lot about magnesium, and I think when I think magnesium, your name is probably the top of the list. So let's wrap on magnesium a little bit. You mentioned magnesium deficiency can lead to insulin resistance. And I've seen you post things about what staggeringly large percentage of the population based on age ranges are deficient in magnesium. But why don't you walk me through some of that stuff, and then we can talk about why you think so many people are deficient in this mineral?
Yeah, so the range based on our review paper is really anywhere from about 20 to really upwards of 80% of the population could be deficient in magnesium. And that's usually not even looking at the gold standard ways to measure. That's just looking at like basically low blood levels. But sometimes they'll use like IV magnesium load tests where they essentially give about 400 milligrams of magnesium over 4 hours IV, and you see how much comes out in the urine over 24 hours. And if the body's holding on to a certain percentage, then you're considered deficient. And as you have more disease states, the increase in the prevalence of magnesium deficiency goes up. So osteoporosis is about the highest, been documented. About 80% of people with osteoporosis have magnesium deficiency. And then when you look at the quote unquote healthiest population that's been studied, like college students, you're looking at about 20% of those. But you're really not looking at gold standard tests like mononuclear blood cell, which is the only blood magnesium test that's actually been standardized to match IV magnesium load test. It's probably even higher. So if I had to estimate, on average, probably 50% of the US population is magnesium deficient to some degree. And even marginal deficiency increases the risk of arrhythmias. Like there's been good studies showing that if you bring the magnesium intake down to 100, 110 milligrams, 1 out of 3 people develop atrial fibrillation. So we know that you want to be consuming obviously more than 100 milligrams of magnesium. The studies that I've looked at on a typical standard American diet have shown that you have to get at least, at the bare minimum, 150 to 180 on a standard American diet. Otherwise, you will slowly deplete the body of magnesium. So if you're on a whole nutritious diet, you might be able to get away with maybe 125 milligrams of magnesium and still remain in balance. Of course, that doesn't mean optimal intake.
And one of the things we talked about in our last podcast, which seems like a lifetime ago, was the fact that I think we agreed on this then, that a lot of magnesium deficiency probably happens because so much of the population is obese and insulin resistant, and that causes wasting of magnesium.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Hyperinsulinemia will increase the loss of magnesium in the urine, and it will also decrease the ability of magnesium to get into the cell. And so your body is unable to utilize magnesium, because there is a significant insulin component to driving both magnesium and potassium into the cell. So if the cell becomes insulin resistant, you're almost automatically deficient in magnesium now, because you can't really get it into the cell very well. So that's a kind of an overlooked reason or cause for magnesium deficiency, is literally the cell becoming insulin resistant.
Is the mononuclear cell magnesium blood test available widely? I'm going to no, you can't get it like LabCorp.
It's more of a research tool. You can see if you can get it. But yeah, that's more of a research tool. But you know what? Here's what's interesting is if you raise the cutoff on blood magnesium to a more optimal cutoff, blood can actually be a fairly good indicator. So the typical cutoff for magnesium deficiency is less than 1.7 milligrams per deciliter. But our review paper showed that if you're less than 2 milligrams per deciliter and you have a low urinary magnesium, that is very highly indicative of magnesium deficiency. So with any nutrient, you always want to have 2 measurements, whether it be blood plus urine or mononuclear cell plus blood. You always want to have at least 2 measurements to sort of try to indicate if you are deficient or not.
Have you ever done any of those blood tests on yourself? That'd be so interesting.
I haven't, but I do the Inside Tracker blood test, and my magnesium is always around 2.1 milligrams. It's never less than 2, which is really, you don't want to be less than 2 ideally.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I can go back and look at my blood work real quick in this podcast and let everybody know what my magnesium was. But I'm going to Los Angeles in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to get some more blood work. And I bet urinary magnesium is something people could get fairly easily. And so if people are curious about magnesium status, you could just do a blood level of magnesium and a urinary magnesium then.
Yes, because there's urine test strips. Vivu is one company that will measure magnesium in the urine. Essentially, a third of your dietary magnesium comes out in the urine. So if you're consuming 300 milligrams in the diet, 100 will come out in the urine. So typically, when you're below 100, you're not probably getting a good amount of magnesium.
But You'd have to do like a 24-hour urine for that.
That would be a 24, but there are urine test strips, basically that will just kind of calculate that out for you in a spot test. Again, nothing's perfect, which is why you always want to have 2 tests.
Yeah, that's interesting. A urinary spot. That's cool.
Now, blood isn't perfect, right? Because, you can have a normal blood, but your ionized magnesium is low. Okay. So the magnesium is super complex. You know what I mean? Actually, ionized magnesium is better, but in certain things can actually raise serum magnesium, but cause magnesium deficiency. Like if you're on a thiazide diuretic, that's been shown to actually raise serum levels of magnesium, but to cause magnesium deficiency. So there's a lot of, intricacies on this.
Interesting. So is it worth somebody checking an ionized magnesium?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some worth and some value there. And there's been studies actually that have shown that serum ionized magnesium actually matches intracellular ionized magnesium very well, which is really what you're looking for, right? Because most magnesium is in the cell and the active form is the ionized. You can't get an ionized magnesium in the cell test very easily. So to know that there's studies showing that the serum ionized matches very well with what's going on in the cell, that's a good test to get.
Oh, cool. Interesting. So I'm going to probably get a serum mag and ionized mag, and maybe if I can find some spot urinary magnesium strips in the States, I'll post about it. But my magnesium, the last time I had it checked was 2. So
that's perfect too.
So maybe a little better. So just for the sources of magnesium, we can run through these for people. In your daily diet, where do you get magnesium? I know you supplement as well, probably, but in your diet, maybe you don't even need to supplement.
So it's hard to say because I used to eat more fish, which is higher typically in magnesium in shellfish, versus like, let's say land animal meat. Although you can get a decent amount if you're consuming typically I think a pound of meat is around 50 to 75 milligrams of magnesium, around thereabouts, maybe up to 100, depending on.
Some estimates I've seen are over 100. Yeah.
Yeah. The ranges are completely different. Of course, that's always going to happen, right? Depending on the feed and what animal you're looking at, but a good range would be 50 to 100 milligrams of magnesium per pound of meat. So you're ideally hoping to get about 150 milligrams of magnesium as a bare minimum, which is why I typically always get at least 100 milligrams as a supplement, because I know my diet isn't super, super high in magnesium, because all the things that I used to eat that are high in magnesium, I don't really eat anymore, like nuts and spinach and all these other quote unquote high magnesium things. They have other, harms at high doses. So it's like,
interesting. Okay. Yeah. Why don't you eat those foods anymore?
Well, number one, they don't really taste very good, to be fair. Like, I was sick of just trying to force spinach down my throat.
Yeah.
Mainly why. I think there's a little more joint issues I was having too when I was eating more of those foods.
Oxalates?
Potentially. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm having Sally Norton on the podcast next week, and she just wrote a book, Toxic Superfoods. So that's kind of cool. I've been kind of geeking out on oxalates again, but I've always thought about that. My magnesium was lowest based on my subjective experience and my blood work, which was a different type of blood work. It was like a SpectraCell, some of these functional medicine labs. My magnesium was in the toilet when I was a raw vegan, eating tons of leafy greens and tons of almonds. I've always wondered, at least in things like almonds, how bioavailable the magnesium is, because there's phytic acid and there's oxalates, which we know are going to prevent the absorption of the magnesium. I mean, there's been parallel studies with other divalent cations like zinc with oysters and beans and wheat and tortillas. And the spinach thing is a real problem, because you're just going to get spinach is just an oxalate bomb. There's so much. I think today we just did a reel on oxalates in a smoothie, and 2 cups of spinach is like 450 milligrams of oxalates. And people can listen to the podcast with Sally for the full oxalate download, but probably we want to have 50 to 100 milligrams of oxalates per day in our diet. And so a lot of these foods that are supposedly really great, high in magnesium, are oxalate bombs.
Right.
I was encouraged to learn that with my diet, coconut water has a good amount of magnesium. And so I'm lucky to be in Costa Rica. I can just get coconuts all the time. So most of what I drink is coconut water these days. I don't actually drink water. All of the low carbers, I love you, will get triggered at that, but so be it. But it's really high in magnesium, and milk is actually pretty good for magnesium. A couple cups of milk has a good amount of magnesium. Orange juice has a good amount of magnesium. And there was at least one more thing that I was eating every day that had a good amount of magnesium. But between the milk, the orange juice, and the
Meat, you're getting it from meat too.
the meat, yep, the meat and the coconuts, I was getting over 400 milligrams of magnesium per day in my diet. So that's really interesting. Yeah, but I think that a lot of people are deficient. They're not getting enough. And you guys can use Chronometer or whatever you want to like look based on the USDA database, but getting enough magnesium is pretty critical. Do you want to talk a little bit about hydration? Before the podcast, you were saying this is like a huge research project that you're interested in. Like, how do people optimize hydration status?
Yeah. So it's the most, the largest nutrient in our body, right? It's like 60% of our body is water. And yet like there is no real good guidelines on fluid intake. It's kind of crazy when you really think about it, right? So I really wanted to understand like what is optimal hydration. And I'll just kind of go over some high level things and you can sort of kind of ask me questions on that. But basically what I learned is that thirst is a survival mechanism and it doesn't get activated unless you consume like salt or something like that, unless you are anywhere from 0.8 to 2% dehydrated. In other words, if you are only drinking when you are thirsty, then you are constantly dehydrated and you're playing catch up. Now, I've never been a fan of just drink water. But when I learned that, and I learned that if thirst was a mechanism that kept you optimally hydrated, it would be telling you to drink more often than was like really physiologically you would want evolutionarily. It'd be this signal that was just constantly super annoying. So it only gets activated when you're already dehydrated. So that's number one. Number two, we lose about 4% of our total body weight per day in water. That's when you don't actually have any perceivable sweat. So if you want to figure out, like if you're not widely overweight because fat only contains 10% water and muscle contains 75% water. So if you're highly overweight, you don't want to do the 4% rate calculation because you're going to be drinking way more water than you actually need because you're mostly fat and fat's only 10% water. But 4% of your total body weight is a good estimate of how much water you need per day. And then typically 2/3 of that would come from fluid. And then 1/3 of that would come from like whole foods. But essentially, like for me, I think I need around 3 liters of water per day. So I typically get about like 2 liters of water from beverages. And then I get about 1 liter from my diet because most of my diet is water. So most people, a good estimate is take your body weight in pounds, divide it in half if you're not super overweight, and that's how many ounces of water you should consume total. And then really consuming small amounts more frequently is up to 40% more hydrating and is going to cause you to go to the bathroom much less than just drinking like 3 large amounts of water throughout the day. So like really I've tried to always have a bottle of water around me and not like slam a ton of it, just slowly sip it like throughout the day. And I've noticed that my hydration is much better.
And as you're doing this with this much liquid, you need to probably take in more electrolytes, either through salt with your food, basically whole foods that have these electrolytes, potassium and fruit, or these kind of things, right? Because the flip side is if you're just drinking water, you can become hyponatremic, probably not with 3 liters a day, but you could lower your serum sodium a little bit, I think, with that.
Yeah. So essentially like the key is, again, the nuance, right? It's like, you can consume a decent amount of water and it's not going to lead to really much of a flushing out effect if it's spaced over a long window. The problem where people get into trouble with hyponatremia is, well, when arginine vasopressin is activated, like when you're exercising to conserve fluid, and then you start slamming large amounts of free water, now you're getting yourself into trouble because the body is in a water-logged, water-conserving state from a hormonal perspective. But no, 100%. I'm not saying like, I mean, I'm the salt guy. So of course, salt is super important for hydration, but I hadn't really researched the water part of this, right? I've always been like really into the salt part, but I've never really fully understood what's an optimal fluid intake and what's the best way to measure like hydration status. And really, you don't want to measure dehydration because that's something that you don't want to happen. So what can you measure before you get dehydrated? And it's actually underhydration or low water intake. And the best way to measure that is a urine morning specific gravity. Is one of the best ways to actually know if you've been consuming a good amount of water or not, or an evening urine specific gravity. And as long as you haven't had a lot of fluid within 2 hours of that test, then it's going to be a good indication if you are consuming a good amount of water or a low amount of water. And the reason why everyone is so focused on dehydration and I'm focused on underhydration, like is because you can go a full day without drinking any water and your osmolality might not change a lot, which is the gold standard for testing for dehydration. So you want to test underhydration, which is only shown through the urine, and that occurs much quicker. So really just urine is a really great way to understand if you're consuming a good amount of water or not.
So this would be like first morning urine specific gravity?
Yes. Yeah.
What would you want to see it at?
Ideally 1.005 to 1.015.
Okay, yeah. Because 1.005 is like maximally dilute, right? Like that's pretty much as low as it goes.
Well, one is essentially is basically the exact, that's free water. You don't want that.
Yep. Yeah. So, but 1.015 would be, you wouldn't want it any more concentrated than that.
You wouldn't want it more, right? Because then that's suboptimal hydration status. And technically dehydration is 1.020.
Okay. Interesting. 1.020. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's easy. I mean, you guys can get that with like a first morning urine analysis. If you go to get blood work, just get a urinalysis, and every urinalysis is going to have a specific gravity, and you'll get a sense of how hydrated you are at the time. Now, as the morning goes on, you're going to become a little more, it's tricky. I mean, is this somebody that's like hasn't had anything to drink? That's the first thing when you wake up in the morning. Yeah.
Like the first thing you want to do when you wake up, if you want to test your hydration status or in regards to have you been consuming a good amount of water, would be your urine specific gravity.
Do they sell strips for that people could use in their homes?
Yeah. Vivu does that. And they also test for magnesium too.
Oh, interesting. How do you spell that?
VIVOO.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. I'll have to check them out.
Yeah.
Now, do you pee in the middle of the night?
Yes, I do.
How many times?
Anywhere from like 2 to 3, typically.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hate that. I pee like once in the middle of the night, but sometimes I'll go the whole night without peeing. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's like, it's like, am I overhydrated if I have to get up in the middle of the night to pee? I've always wondered about that. I mean, presuming that both of us are adult men and both of us have low PSAs. Neither of us has prostatic hypertrophy, which I know, and I'm sure you from my labs. So this isn't a urinary retention issue. It's just, I'm just curious for your subjective experience.
Yeah, I know. And it's, increased urinary frequency of urination. It kind of runs in my family. Like that seems to be a problem. So, and I've always been someone that's even before increasing or being more adamant about my fluid intake, I've always woken up at least once to pee at night. I mean, I never go through a full night without waking up to pee. But there's a huge problem being underhydrated, not just dehydrated, but a low water intake increases the risk of tons of issues. Type 2 diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality. Like you can give animals sugar and there will be more fat deposits if they're dehydrated versus not. So dehydration, a lack of a low fluid intake is not a good thing, because think about it. Water is the universal solvent where every biochemical reaction occurs. And your fluid status too is also determined by salt. I don't want to just talk about water. A low salt versus a normal salt intake, you will have a 2-pound difference in fluid. So we know that low salt diets barely lower blood pressure, unless you're hypertensive. But what they do is they completely dehydrate you. Your total body water goes down by about 2 pounds. Now, you might not think that's a lot, but when you're an athlete, you will absolutely know the effect of not having 2 extra pounds of water in you from a performance perspective, from a cognition perspective. So 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams of sodium with 2 to 3 liters of water is typically on average what most people want to aim for.
And that 3 to 5 grams of sodium means 6 to 10 grams of salt.
Yeah, exactly. So a teaspoon of salt is around anywhere from 2,100 to 2,300 milligrams of sodium, depending on the other minerals that are in it.
Right.
So you're talking about 1.5 to 2 teaspoons of salt every day is really your optimal intake, along with around 2 to 3 liters of water, more around the 2 liters for a woman, and then more around 3 liters for an average typical sized man.
Interesting. So what I would recommend people do is take one of the scales from Amazon, if people have it in their house, a gram scale, and weigh out, 7 grams of salt to 10 grams of salt. So you see how much that is, and then use that throughout the day and see if you're getting 7 to 10 grams of salt. But just remember that most salt is sodium chloride plus other minerals. And what James is saying here is just the sodium component of that. So it's not 3 to 5 grams of salt, it's 3 to 5 grams of sodium. And you're going to need to weigh that out or look at that to see how much you're getting. I think unless you are physically restricting salt, most people probably get that because our bodies kind of crave that when we have access to it. I mean, it's just, if you're salting your steak or your eggs to taste, I think most of us probably are getting something reasonable. But if you're not, that would be a really good improvement in your functionality. And certainly, yeah.
Well, so if you're eating a whole food diet, right, you're not getting the salty fluids anymore. And so your whole food diet is going to be really low in salt. So you absolutely have to be throwing in anywhere from 2 to 4 grams of sodium. Otherwise, you're going to feel like crap.
Exactly. So that's why weigh it out and have the salt as part of your daily thing, just so you see how much you're using. But don't fear salt, guys.
Yeah.
James, thank you so much for this podcast. We covered everything. That was amazing. I think people probably learned a ton. Where can people find you? And what's the most recent book you wrote? You write, like I've said, you've written so many. It's ridiculous.
The Collagen Cure was the most.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where can people find that or follow you for social media stuff?
Yeah, those books are on Amazon, and my website is drjamesdinick.com, and social media is at drjamesdinick.
Amazing. And your tweets are popping off on Instagram all the time or Twitter, and amazing. So thanks for coming on, brother. And I hope we get to hang out in person soon.
Yeah,
I need a steak.
Let's do it. We got to do it. We're long overdue.
I know.